An irritated ambulance driver notices a mysterious dog following his vehicle on every emergency call. Exasperated by the animal's persistence, he decides to investigate its motivations. Upon uncovering the dog's past, the driver becomes so deeply shaken that he returns home in uncontrollable tears. What happens in the following days is unbelievable. Before we dive in, if you, like us, love animals, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any heartwarming stories. Thanks. Let's get back to our tale. It was a crisp fall morning when Robert first noticed the golden Labrador in the rearview mirror of his ambulance. The dog was chasing the vehicle with a determination that caught his attention, but he decided to ignore it. After all, as an EMT with 15 years of experience, Robert had learned to stay focused solely on his mission, saving lives. The day started like any other in Chicago. The overcast sky and the light drizzle typical of the city created that melancholic atmosphere that perfectly matched his mood. Robert adjusted the rearview mirror, checked the essential equipment, and began his shift promptly at 7 in the morning, as he always did. The first call came less than half an hour later. An elderly man suspected of having a stroke in Lincoln Park. As he drove through the still, quiet streets of the early morning, Robert noticed the same Labrador chasing the ambulance again. The dog maintained a steady pace, its eyes fixed on the vehicle as if its life depended on it. Must be a coincidence, Robert thought, turning right onto Clark Street. The dog kept following, skillfully dodging the few cars on the road. There was something different about this animal. Something in its eyes that conveyed a message Robert couldn't quite decipher. When they arrived at the emergency address, Robert parked the ambulance and watched through the rearview mirror as his team quickly disembarked to attend to the patient. The Labrador stopped a few feet away, sat on the sidewalk, and kept watch, as if standing guard. Throughout the incident, which lasted about 40 minutes, the dog didn't move. It remained seated, attentive to every movement around the ambulance. Robert tried to focus on his work, but his eyes kept drifting back to the animal in the mirror. On the way back to the station, the Labrador followed the vehicle again, maintaining the same determined pace. Robert began to feel a growing unease. In his years of experience, he'd seen many strange things, but there was something about this dog that stirred him in an inexplicable way. At the station, the animal stopped at the entrance to the parking lot, sat down, and watched as the ambulance was parked. Robert got out of the vehicle and for the first time looked directly at the dog. The Labrador held his gaze with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Robert turned his gaze back to the entrance, but the Labrador had disappeared. He felt a chill run down his spine. He was certain he'd seen it there just seconds ago. At the end of the day, while filling out his report, Robert couldn't get the image of those sad, determined eyes out of his head. It had been years since he'd felt so intrigued by something. Since his divorce, he'd closed himself off in his routine, avoiding anything that might disrupt his carefully organized world. Driving home that night, Robert found himself thinking about the dog. Why was it specifically following his ambulance? Why couldn't anyone else see it? And why, after so many years of keeping a safe distance from any emotional involvement, did he feel so unsettled by a simple animal? As he entered his quiet 10th-floor apartment, Robert stopped in front of the only photo he kept on the wall. Him, his ex-wife Marina, and their daughter Laura, smiling on a beach day 3 years ago, before everything fell apart, before loneliness became his only constant companion. The next morning, Robert arrived at work earlier than usual. He parked his car and spent a few minutes watching the station entrance through the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the Labrador appear. The parking lot remained empty, except for a few pigeons pecking distractedly at the asphalt. "You're losing it, Robert," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. 15 years on the job had taught him to maintain his sanity through emotional detachment. It was a rule he followed strictly, especially after his personal life had fallen apart. The first call of the day came just after 8, an elderly woman with breathing difficulties in Wicker Park. As he maneuvered the ambulance out of the station, Robert instinctively checked the rearview mirror. His heart raced when he saw the Labrador appear, as if materializing out of thin air, running at its steady pace behind the vehicle. During the drive, Robert began to pay closer attention to the details of the animal. Its golden fur, though a bit dull, was relatively well groomed. It didn't look like an ordinary stray. There was a certain nobility in its bearing, even as it tirelessly chased the ambulance. Paul frowned, clearly concerned about his colleague. "Robert, there's no dog following us." At the patient's residence, while the team handled the emergency, Robert stayed in the ambulance, watching the Labrador, which, like the day before, maintained its silent vigil a few feet away. This time, gathering his courage, he decided to get out of the vehicle. The dog tilted its head slightly, as if assessing the man's intentions. Robert could swear he saw a glimmer of recognition in the animal's eyes, something that went beyond the simple interaction between human and dog. Back at the station, Robert decided to do some research. During his lunch break, he searched the computer for recent news involving Labradors in the area. He found nothing relevant. He tried talking to his colleagues about it, but the responses were always the same: confused looks and concerned expressions. In the afternoon, during a call farther out in Bridgeport, Robert noticed something interesting. The Labrador tried to follow the ambulance, but after a few miles, it couldn't keep up. However, when they returned to the station 2 hours later, there it was, faithfully waiting at the entrance to the parking lot. "Did you hear about that case with the Portuguese man? The one with the heart attack?" one of them commented. That night, driving home, Robert couldn't stop thinking about what he'd heard. There was a story there, something he needed to uncover. For the first time in years, he felt an urgency that wasn't related to his job. In his apartment before going to bed, he picked up his phone and looked at the last message from his daughter Laura. "Dad, can I come over next weekend?" The message had been sitting there for 3 days, unanswered. Robert always made excuses to postpone these visits, fearing the pain they inevitably brought. The next morning, Robert did something he'd never done before. He stopped at a pet store on his way to work. The clerk, a friendly woman with graying hair, smiled as she saw him hesitantly examining the dog food section. He left the store with a bag of premium dog food and a collapsible water bowl. He felt both ridiculous and anxious. In 15 years as an EMT, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and something told him he was on the right path. Arriving at the station, he found the Labrador already in its usual spot, patiently sitting near the entrance to the parking lot. Robert parked his personal car and for the first time approached the animal before even starting his shift. He stepped back and watched. The dog remained still for a few moments, as if assessing the situation. Then, slowly, it approached the water bowl. Robert felt a tightness in his chest as he watched the animal drink, wondering how long it had been there, waiting, watching, following the ambulance day after day. The Labrador lifted its head from the bowl and looked directly at him. There was something in that gaze that made Robert feel exposed, as if the animal could see through the layers of indifference he'd built up over the years. Throughout the day, the pattern repeated. The Labrador followed the ambulance on nearby calls, waited patiently during the emergencies, and was always back at the station when they returned from more distant incidents. But now, there was a difference. Robert had started talking to it. Paul, his partner, began giving him concerned looks when he caught him apparently talking to himself. During lunch, he finally decided to bring it up. "Is it because of Laura's visit this weekend?" At the end of his shift, Robert left more food and fresh water for the dog before heading home. He watched in the rearview mirror as he drove away, seeing the Labrador sitting, vigilant, guarding a secret that was slowly beginning to reveal itself. "Hi, Marina, it's about Laura. I wanted to know if she's allergic to dogs." Saturday dawned with a different clarity. Robert woke up earlier than usual, a familiar nervousness churning in his stomach. Laura would arrive in a few hours, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking for excuses to postpone the visit. Robert mechanically tidied up the apartment, dusting the few pieces of furniture and arranging the cushions on the couch he rarely used. He opened the windows, letting in the fresh morning air. In the process, he found old photos tucked away in a drawer. Laura learning to walk, her first day of school, birthdays at 5, 6, 7 years old. The more recent pictures were scarce, a consequence of his gradual withdrawal. The doorbell rang promptly at 10. Robert took a deep breath before opening the door, finding his 12-year-old daughter smiling shyly. Laura had grown taller since the last time he'd seen her, her brown hair now shoulder length, her eyes, so much like his, shining with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. "Come in, please." Robert hesitated. How could he explain the inexplicable? "It's a bit of a complicated story," he began. "How about we go to the EMT station? I can show you where I work, and maybe we can find the dog." At the EMT station, Robert parked his personal car in its usual spot. His heart raced when he saw the Labrador in its habitual place, patiently sitting near the entrance. Robert felt a tightness in his chest. Of course, she couldn't see it. No one could, except him. He was about to make up an excuse when he noticed something extraordinary. The Labrador had stood up and was walking toward them, but its eyes were fixed on Laura. "Do you want to meet my daughter?" he whispered to the animal. Robert watched in awe as his daughter hesitantly reached out her hand to the space where the Labrador was sitting. The dog moved its snout closer to her hand, and Laura gasped. Tears unexpectedly welled up in Robert's eyes. There was his daughter, unable to see the dog, but somehow sensing its presence. It was as if the Labrador was building a bridge between them, filling the void that years of distance had created. Laura smiled, her hand still extended in the air, where the Labrador remained seated, watching father and daughter with its wise, gentle eyes. At that moment, something inside Robert shifted definitively. The words began to flow, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to be truly vulnerable in front of his daughter. The Labrador stayed by their side, a silent and comforting presence, as if guarding this precious moment of reconnection between father and daughter. The rest of that morning passed like a dream for Robert. Sitting on a bench near the station, he told Laura about his experiences with the mysterious Labrador, how the dog had appeared out of nowhere, following only his ambulance, how no one else could see it, and how its constant presence was, in some way, changing something inside him. Laura listened intently, her eyes shining with a mix of fascination and emotion. Every now and then, she reached out her hand to the space where the Labrador was sitting, smiling at the inexplicable sensation of cold. Robert had never been a man to believe in supernatural things. His work had taught him to trust only what he could see, touch, and measure. But now, watching his daughter interact with a presence she couldn't see but could feel, something began to shift in his perspective. More present. Before, even when we were together, it felt like you were always far away, thinking about other things. Now you're really here. At that moment, the radio in his pocket crackled. It was his day off, but he always kept the radio on, a habit from years of work. There was an emergency nearby. An elderly woman had fallen at home, possibly with a fractured femur. Robert hesitated, looking at the Labrador, whose eyes remained fixed on him. To his surprise, the dog didn't move when he stood up. For the first time since it had appeared, the Labrador made no move to follow the ambulance. When he returned to the station, he found Laura exactly where he'd left her, chatting animatedly with the empty space beside her. The Labrador was lying close to her, its eyes attentive and kind. "Robert, what are you doing here on your day off?" "Oh yes, Mr. Manuel. It was one of the saddest calls I've ever responded to. His dog, I've never seen anything like it. It waited by the building's entrance for days after the owner. Well, After Tony walked away, Robert and Laura stood in silence, processing the information. The Labrador had stood up and was now watching them with an intensity that made Robert's heart ache. Robert looked at the dog, really looked, and for the first time began to understand. It wasn't by chance that the animal had chosen his ambulance, his station, his life to enter. There was a greater purpose there, a lesson he needed to learn about loyalty, love, and the courage to remain open to what life had to offer. The rest of that Saturday passed in a whirlwind of emotions for Robert and Laura. After the revelation about Mr. Manuel, they decided to do a little investigation. Laura, with her natural tech-savvy skills, quickly found more information online. Manuel Oliveira, 72, had been a Portuguese immigrant who lived alone with his Labrador, Thor, in an apartment 3 blocks from the EMT station. A retired shopkeeper, he was known in the neighborhood for his kindness and the inseparable bond he shared with his dog. Robert felt his heart stop for a moment. In the photograph, a white-haired man smiled next to a golden Labrador, the same one now watching them with its deep, wise eyes, the same one that had been following his ambulance for weeks. "So that's his name?" Laura smiled, reaching out her hand to the space where the dog was. "Thor, like the god of thunder." It was Tony who responded to the call. Robert realized, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. Thor must have tried to follow the ambulance that night. "Maybe," he began slowly, "because I needed to learn something Thor is trying to teach me." Silent tears streamed down Robert's face as he spoke. Thor moved closer, pressing its ethereal snout against the man's hand. Laura, though she couldn't see the gesture, felt the change in the air's temperature. Laura held her father's hand tightly. "But you never lost me, Dad. I've always been here." "Marina," he said into the phone, "could we all have dinner together tonight? There's a story I need to tell you both." After hanging up, Robert noticed that Thor had stood up and was watching them with an expression that seemed almost proud. "Let's go home," he said, smiling at his daughter and his invisible friend. "We've got a family dinner to prepare." "I brought the ingredients for that lasagna you always liked," she said, placing the bags on the kitchen counter. Her eyes scanned the room, noticing small changes, the open windows, old photos arranged on the table, a different spark in Robert's eyes. "Mom," Laura exclaimed excitedly, "you're not going to believe what happened today. Dad has a new friend, but it's a special friend." Dinner preparation turned into an almost magical moment. Laura alternated between helping in the kitchen and chatting with the empty space where Thor was. Marina watched her daughter with a mix of confusion and amusement, while Robert coordinated everything with a lightness he hadn't felt in years. "Remember when we used to do this every Sunday?" Marina commented at one point, grating cheese for the lasagna. Her tone was nostalgic, without the bitterness that usually accompanied memories of the past. "Wow, that was a strange chill," she murmured, rubbing her arm. Robert took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Thor's, which encouraged him with that serene wisdom only dogs seem to possess. Marina listened in silence, her eyes filling with tears, as Robert reached the part about how Thor was helping him reconnect with his own feelings, with his family. "It's not crazy, Dad," Laura whispered, holding his hand across the table. "It's love." "There's one more thing," Robert said, gathering his courage. "Marina, Laura, I know I made a lot of mistakes in the past. I closed myself off when I should have opened up. I ran when I should have stayed. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to fix things, for real this time." "Dad," Laura was the first to speak, her voice choked with emotion, "I don't think Thor came into your life by accident." "She won't stop talking about Thor," Marina commented over the phone, a smile evident in her voice. "Even though she can't see him, she's formed a special connection with him." One particularly busy afternoon, during an emergency call for an elderly man with heart problems, Robert noticed something different in the Labrador's behavior. Instead of just observing from a distance as it usually did, Thor approached the patient's house, its snout pointing insistently at a specific drawer in the living room. Robert hesitated for a moment, then followed his instinct. That drawer. Can we check if there's anything important in there? Maybe medical documents? At the end of that week, Laura showed up unexpectedly at the station with Marina. They brought a small homemade cake they had prepared together. "You know," Marina commented thoughtfully, "since you told us about Thor, I've been researching similar stories. There are so many accounts around the world, people who receive special visits at important moments in their lives." Thor, lying at Robert's feet, lifted its head at those words. Its eyes met Marina's, and for a brief moment Robert could swear she saw it too, a golden shadow, a fleeting glimmer of recognition in her gaze. Thor rested its head on Robert's knee, its eyes conveying an ancient and gentle wisdom. Robert allowed himself to sink his fingers into the dog's ethereal fur, feeling that familiar chill he now associated with comfort and hope. Thor let out a soft sigh, its eyes momentarily distant, as if remembering its former owner. Then it turned its gaze back to Robert with an intensity that made him swallow hard. The Labrador stood up, wagging its tail gently. For the first time since it had appeared, Thor barked, a sound only Robert could hear, but one that seemed to carry all the joy and affirmation in the world. Robert smiled, showing the photo to Thor. "Looks like we've got another family gathering coming up," he said, his heart light at the prospect. The Labrador pressed its cold snout against the phone screen, as if blessing that moment, that promise of more happy memories to come. The weekend arrived with an unexpected surprise. Marina and Laura hadn't just prepared a special lunch. They had organized a small picnic at the park near the EMT station. The location held special meaning. It was where Robert and Marina had met 15 years ago when she worked as a nurse at the nearby hospital. Thor, who had been faithfully accompanying them, seemed especially lively that morning. Its eyes shone with a youthful joy as it circled around the family, occasionally stopping to observe other families also enjoying the sunny day in the park. Robert smiled, noticing how Thor had moved closer to Marina at that moment, its eyes full of affection. "He's right beside you now," he said softly. Her words carried a weight that went beyond the present situation. Robert knew she wasn't just talking about Thor and its former owner, but also about themselves, about the marriage they had lost, about the time they had let slip away. Laura, who had quietly approached, sat between her parents. Thor completed the circle, lying protectively around them. Marina and Robert exchanged a surprised look. Their daughter, who had suffered so much from the separation, was there, offering a metaphor of hope and healing. Thor let out a soft bark that only Robert could hear, as if approving the girl's words. The Labrador then stood up and began doing something curious. It walked in circles around the family, as if weaving an invisible bond between them. "Like the gold in the broken porcelain," Laura whispered, understanding. Laura hugged her mother, crying and laughing at the same time. Robert felt his own tears streaming down as Thor approached, touching each of them with its cold snout, like a blessing. Thor sat majestically before them, its eyes shining with deep satisfaction. The Labrador seemed larger somehow, more luminous, as if its mission was reaching a new level of fulfillment. The days following the park picnic brought even deeper changes to Robert's life and his family. The brief moment when Marina had seen Thor seemed to break the last barriers that still existed between them. Phone conversations became longer, more meaningful, and family gatherings more frequent. At work, Robert noticed a change in how he handled emergencies. Thor's constant presence by his side had awakened a sensitivity in him he didn't know he possessed. He began to notice small details he had previously overlooked. The fear in patients' eyes, the silent worry of family members, the need for a comforting word beyond technical care. One particularly busy morning, they were called to assist an elderly woman who lived alone. The case didn't seem serious, dizziness and high blood pressure, but something in Thor's behavior caught Robert's attention. The Labrador was especially restless, circling around the small living room of the apartment. No, The elderly woman, Mrs. Cecilia, replied with a sad smile. "My children live far away, you know. We've drifted apart over time." Mrs. Cecilia's eyes filled with tears. "It's been so long. Pride, you know. We fight over silly things and then don't know how to make amends." "And there is," Robert affirmed with conviction. "There's always time to reconnect, to heal. I've learned that recently." "You're transforming all of us, aren't you?" Robert murmured to the dog. "One heart at a time." With trembling fingers, Robert replied, "Of course, tomorrow after my shift." "It's funny," he said to Thor, "how sometimes we need a four-legged angel to show us the way back home." Robert realized, with a mix of joy and apprehension, that perhaps Thor's mission was reaching a new stage. The Labrador wasn't just helping his family reconnect, it was teaching all of them how to be guides for one another, like Mrs. Cecilia and her children, like so many other families who just needed a little nudge to find their way back to love. The cafe Marina had chosen was a cozy place with wooden tables and plants hanging from the ceiling. Robert arrived first, accompanied by Thor, who seemed even more luminous than the day before. The Labrador chose a spot near one of the windows and sat serenely, as if it knew exactly what was about to happen. "Hi," she said softly, sitting across from him. "Thank you for coming." They placed their orders, a cappuccino for her, black coffee for him, just like in the old days. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with possibilities. "She's always been sensitive like that," Robert commented, remembering how his daughter, even as a child, seemed to pick up on things adults didn't notice. "I was so afraid," Robert admitted, his voice choked. "Every time I got into that ambulance, I saw people losing their loved ones, families being torn apart in seconds. I started building walls, thinking it would protect me from the pain." Marina intertwined her fingers with his, and Thor let out a satisfied sigh. "I'm sorry too," she said, "for not understanding how much your work affected you, for demanding more than you could give at the time." "You know what Laura told me yesterday?" Marina smiled through tears. "That for the first time in a long time, she feels like she has her family back. Not just during the scheduled weekend moments, but for real." Thor barked at that moment, a sound only Robert could hear, but one that seemed to make the air vibrate around them. The Labrador was now almost translucent, its golden form blending with the sunlight streaming through the window. Marina looked toward the space where she knew Thor was, and for a brief moment, like that day in the park, she could see him again. The golden Labrador, now almost ethereal, gazed at them with so much love and wisdom that it made her heart ache. "Time for what?" Marina asked, still holding Robert's hand. Thor tilted its head, its wise eyes conveying a silent message of confirmation. Robert understood he needed to act quickly. He grabbed his phone and without hesitation called Marina. "Yes," Robert replied, watching as the Labrador seemed to glow more intensely upon hearing its name. "I think he's getting ready to leave." Marina and Laura arrived shortly after. The girl ran to her father as soon as she saw him, her eyes wide as she noticed the change in the atmosphere. "It's him!" Laura exclaimed, tears of joy streaming down her face. "This is what he looks like, exactly how I imagined." Finally, it stopped in front of Robert. The man knelt, coming eye level with the Labrador. In that moment, a series of images flashed through his mind. Mr. Manuel and Thor in happier days, walks in the park, moments of pure and unconditional companionship. He understood that Thor was sharing its memories, showing that true love leaves eternal marks. Thor pressed its snout against Robert's chest, right over his heart. A wave of warmth and light spread through his entire body, and he knew he would never be the same after that moment. A second luminous form had materialized beside Thor, the unmistakable silhouette of Mr. Manuel, smiling with so much love and gratitude that it made everyone present cry. He knelt beside his faithful friend, petting its head one last time. Thor looked one last time at the family it had helped reconnect. Its eyes, now made of pure light, conveyed a clear message. True love never dies. It only transforms, finding new ways to shine. Before disappearing completely, Thor barked one last time, a sound that everyone could now hear, full of joy, gratitude, and promises that love, in its infinite forms, would always be with them. In the days following Thor's departure, a different peace settled into Robert's life and his family's. The parking lot of the EMT station, though empty of the Labrador's physical presence, seemed to retain a subtle glow, as if the light Thor had emanated had left a permanent mark on the place. A week later, Robert was organizing some documents at home when he found something surprising, a yellowed envelope he didn't remember seeing before. Inside was an old photograph and a newspaper clipping. The photo showed a young Mr. Manuel, newly arrived in the US, holding a Labrador puppy in his arms, Thor in its early days with the family. The newspaper clipping told the story of how Manuel had found Thor. The puppy had been abandoned in a cardboard box near the hospital where Marina used to work. It was on the very day Robert and Marina had met. Somehow, their stories had been intertwined long before they realized it. Laura approached, spreading her drawings across the table. There were dozens of illustrations of Thor, each capturing a different aspect of the Labrador, its initial physical form, the gradual luminous transformation, the final moment with Mr. Manuel. The last drawing, however, was different. It showed the family reunited with a golden light enveloping them. Robert hugged his daughter, feeling his heart overflowing with love. At that moment, Marina arrived, carrying some grocery bags. "I couldn't resist," Marina explained, her eyes shining. "It felt like he was telling me to buy it." Robert smiled, recalling the elderly woman he had helped reconnect with her children. "I heard they moved closer to her. One of her sons even transferred his job to the city." Robert realized that Thor's legacy went far beyond his own family. Like ripples in a pond, the love and healing the Labrador had brought continued to spread, touching other lives, inspiring other reconnections. "Sometimes," Marina said softly, "when I'm at the hospital and see families going through tough times, I feel like I know exactly what to say. It's like Thor taught me the language of the heart." Robert wrapped his arms around his family, feeling a deep gratitude for everything they had been through. The apartment that once felt so empty and cold now overflowed with life and warmth. The photographs on the walls were no longer painful reminders, but witnesses to a love story that was gaining new chapters. A shooting star streaked across the sky at that moment, leaving a golden trail that for a brief instant seemed to form the silhouette of a Labrador running through the heavens. Marina and Laura arrived carrying a cake decorated with the EMT symbol. It was no longer unusual to see them there. In recent months, they had become part of the station's extended family. Marina, in fact, had returned to work part-time as a nurse at the nearby hospital. It was Mrs. Cecilia, accompanied by her 3 children. After that fateful day of the emergency call, she had become a frequent visitor to the station, always bringing homemade cookies and stories to share. Her eldest son carried a framed painting, a piece that depicted a golden Labrador running alongside an ambulance, its form blending with the sunlight. The artist had perfectly captured that special luminosity Thor had emanated in its final days. The party continued, filled with stories and laughter. Robert noticed how many of the attendees had their own stories of transformation to tell. Paul, his partner of so many years, had reconciled with his brother after a decade of estrangement. The couple from the 3rd floor had not only stayed together, but now coordinated a support group for families in crisis. Amid the celebrations, Laura pulled her parents to a quieter corner of the parking lot. It was exactly the spot where Thor used to wait for Robert every morning. "It's turned into a comic," she explained proudly. "My teacher helped me publish it in the school newspaper. Other families need to know there's always hope." "Sometimes," Robert said softly, "when I'm driving the ambulance on a tough day, I see a golden reflection in the rearview mirror. It's just for a second, but it reminds me of everything I've learned." The party continued until nightfall. When the first stars began to appear, everyone gathered for a group photo. At the exact moment the flash went off, an inexplicable golden light crossed the sky, creating a luminous arc over everyone. Later, when the photo was developed, many swore they saw the silhouette of a golden Labrador among the people, its soft outline blending with the twilight. But Robert, Marina, and Laura knew they didn't need a photograph to prove what their hearts already knew. True love never truly leaves. It just transforms, finding new ways to shine through us. In the now empty parking lot, a final breeze blew softly, carrying with it the distant echo of a joyful bark and the eternal whisper of a truth Thor had taught them, that we are all guardians of each other's light, forever connected by the invisible bonds of love.